So I wrote up a lot of this. I wrote up a lot of this, and this is still available as Africanized honeybees in the Americas. So how individuals were coping with the bee. So let me start then. As you can see, I am one of the gray hairs of the group. So please, if you would, excuse any senior movements that I might have as I go along. Let me throw you out a couple warm-ups. What do honeybees do with their honey? What do honeybees do with their honey? Of course, they sell it. And a second, what does an allergic bee get? Got this one? Should get this one. They get hives. Yeah, good going. Nice going. Yep, they get hives. All righty. One more. Let's do one more. Two drunks are there in the gutter after an evening. One looks up at the other and says, "Hey, look, here comes man's best friend." To which the second replies, yeah, and it's coming with a dog. All right, first commercial.
Dewey?
Yes.
We're seeing your presenter view, I believe.
Okay. All righty, let's do, I've got a presenter view on too. Oh boy, I may have to go out and go back in then, huh? More slideshow options. Hide presenter view. How's that? Better?
That's it.
Just see the two laugh. All righty. Okay, that's better then. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry for that initial.
No problem.
First commercial. We got just in time for the commercial break here. All righty. I have a pandemic book, Complete Bee Handbook. This is for the rest of the family to try to understand what you're doing. And we've revised the Honey Bee Biology and Beekeeping book now in its third complete edition. I'll be glad to talk to you if you'd like to get we've got an introductory price for the Honey Bee Biology. I have a lower price if you'd like to consider the Complete Bee Handbook. So just drop me a line. I'll be glad to talk to you about it if you have an interest. Where's my advance? There we go. And right along, I've had the field guide, real handy of healthy bees and then bees, some of the things that we might look for in colonies. And I'm fast at work on a BMD program that will run on computers and eventually in a year now, from now on an app. So there's a current version, the BMD, something like our own medical MD type of website, where you have things that you observe. So you ask that question, and through a series of choices, you then get to have some information about what that possible diagnosis might be. So that's the BMD, and currently working on an expanded version with lots more photos. And then the second commercial break, and Bob said he had indicated to you in an email about the availability now of our new 8th edition of Tools for Varroa Management. This is from the Honey Bee Health Coalition. I represent the Western Apiculture Society. I was the author on our first vision, and we just went with an expanded committee through a real extensive revision. More and better information in terms of sampling, and then all of the different options that you might elect to try to do in terms of your tools, both chemicals and non-chemicals. So if you have an older version, I recommend that you download the newest version. And if the club has one that they have downloaded for members, I recommend that you go to the newest version. And I'm not sure, Bob, if does the club have a downloaded version that you might do? Bob, still?
I just sent the email. There's a link that they can click on and download it as a PDF.
Perfect. Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Appreciate it. So I do recommend the newest version. Might help answer a couple of the questions, or partial the questions that came up earlier in terms of temperature. That was great advice. If it's going to spike above 85, a good idea is to take them out for that period of time, put them in a baggie, and then reinsert them. The Formic Pro is a bit temperature sensitive. If you're using the APA Guard, which is the gel, it can go to a higher temperature, but really after 85, it's not as effective. So think of these chemicals 65 to 85. They don't work as well at low temperatures. They don't work as well at newer temperatures or higher temperatures as well. So that information is there. And finally, before we get to the defensive bees, I thought I'd say just a word or two related to some of your questions. What we need to do now is sample for mite numbers. We shouldn't be asking our question of our bees in our apiary here, do you have mites? We need to ask, how many mites do you have? And then our number in terms of thinking of risk, and it's a measure of risk, is 2%. Randy Oliver's number is 1% because he has a higher risk. He doesn't want his colonies to die or get stressed from Varroa mites and then have other issues as well. But for most of us in backyarders, a 2%. And so that would be, if you do a sample of 300 mites, that would be 6 or more mites in your sampling. And now that's an alcohol wash. If you do powdered sugar, you got to add a couple of mites, 1 or 2 mites, because it's just not as an efficient way of doing it. Now, treatment right now, great advice earlier, Pete. Treat for high mite numbers right now with Formic. Formic Pro is the material of choice. We need to get the numbers down. If your numbers are at around 2%, think of using the synthetic Apivar. Apivar will do a nice job for the next 6 weeks and keeping that number down, or hopefully keeping that number down, depending on how much drifting is going on and some other robbing and some other factors. But we've got to get that number down because in just a bit now, in this month and into October, the bees need to rear the bees that are going to get through winter. So the bees that are going to suspend the aging process. And those bees have to have a lot of vitellogenin in their fat body. Mites feed on that fat body and rob the individual bees of that fat body, of that protein that's in the fat body. And they just need that because your colony is going to depend upon those overwintered bees with good solid fat bodies to kick up their glands in the spring and start rearing replacement bees, because of course our numbers go down over the winter. Half the colonies from the back, see how they are in terms of feed. So here we've got an apiary that's got 2 colonies, 2 standard colonies, and 2 nukes. I'm sorry, I think that's only 1 nuke at this point, a nuke that's double nuke. In other words, the nearest yellow and green is our nuke boxes. The middle colony has a feeder on top, and as does the far colony, the blue box, the yellow box on the middle colony, and the blue box on the far end are feeders. And then that at the end is also going to be a winterizing box, a area which we can put insulation for the winter. Maybe an indication, a little bit of robbing there. You see all the bees lined up along that yellow box. Got to be a little bit careful. Probably best not to put scent in that sugar water this time of year. Just plain sugar water. Be very careful feeding honey, since bees and ants and mice and a lot of other things like the honey. Combined, one of the things that we've often recommended is that if you've got a weak colony, combine it to a strong colony. For those of you that get bee culture, my PhD student, Jim, too, has done a regular column for ages for bee culture. In this current one that is out this month, he is talking about combining, and he has some good insight into know what you're doing when you combine. If your colony has some real issue, that's why it's weak, it's not doing well. If you combine it to another colony, you might just be bringing that problem to a second colony. We sometimes just don't let a colony die or euthanize a colony. And I'll talk about that with defensive bees. Sometimes we do. We need to get rid of colonies that just aren't doing what we need them to do. We can't solve all bee problems. And we just sort of willy-nilly say, well, it's weak, combine it with something else. Well, it may not do the colony you combine it with any good, and it may in fact do some harm. So if you want a little bit different insight, I recommend the last couple pages of Bee Culture this month's magazine. If you don't have a copy, let me know and I'll get you a copy of it. We want to reduce entrances here. We've got robbing screens on the colony, not on the nuke. That's a reduced entrance. You see all the bees, the nearest colony, all the bees to the left there, to the right hand side. But the other two have robbing screens on them, and that's some of the reason for the confusion of the flight in front, and also the robbers flying there a bit in the front. So reduce the entrance. Robbing screens are just a marvelous invention for just you can make your own easily enough. They don't cost very much. There are like 10 different varieties that are available, at least 10 varieties that are available. So find one that you like, and we certainly recommend them for this time of year. And if you're in areas where there's heavy predation of yellow jackets, if you're in a field where there are heavy populations of field mice, you want to try to get those controlled. So for yellow jackets, put out one of the fermenting sugar traps for each colony that you have, or 2 or 3. You'll trap a lot of adults. You won't stop all the predation, but you'll trap a lot of adults throughout the bags as you go along, because they will not go into the bags after a while just because of the smell. Mice, the reduced entrance for mice. Elevation, as you see here on a hive stand, will help against mice. Skunks can get pretty active with colonies. So those are some of the things that we might do now this time of year. And some of those things came up here in your discussion that was earlier. Let me, however, go to my topic and talk about defensive bees. I'm going to define them. Talk about Africanized bees, some basics of that. Come back and circle around and say, so need we be concerned? And then if we do have defensive bees, how can we handle them? So ready, saddle up. We got our bee blanket on our trusty steed, and our own armament covered with our bees and our skeps. So let's head on out for the battle of defensive bees. Thought I'd start with the bees. So this is maybe what the bees are saying. Here's one bee talking to another one. Look, I'm a beekeeper. Ouch, darn it. Ouch, ouch. Where's my hive tool? Ouch, ouch, ouch. That smoker is out again. Ouch, ouch, ouch. Wonder what our bees are saying about us. I wonder if they're thinking about us. What might we be saying in terms of defensive bees? I don't care for the term aggressive. The biology that's going on is defense. So I will tend not to use aggressive. If I do, I owe the pod $1 every time I do say it, because I rather use the term defense. Okay. All of our colonies have guards, and you saw that in the earlier illustration of the 2 colonies with the nuke. Colony has guards, but the stinging bees, the ones that end up often going to sting us, are not those guards. It's the soldiers of the hive. And so the stinging will often come as we open up the colony rather than from those guards that are at the entrance. Bee defense is a 4-stage response. It's not a simple one. It's quite complex. The 4 stages are alerting, activating, attracting, and then a 4-stage. So in our colony, the first thing that we do if we're trying to determine how defensive it is we alert it. We hit it with something. As beekeepers, what we do is we open it, we bump it, we walk in front of it, okay? Something to alert. It can be daily alerting, it can be nightly alerting from a skunk, but something then starts triggering bees to be in a mode to be more defensive. The activation stage is when bees will fly towards that disturbance or fly off looking for movement, looking for smell, looking for something that's not in their wheelhouse. Something is different. So for us as beekeepers, that means we open it up and they're right away in our face, flying right at our face. They're keying in on our carbon dioxide. They're keying in that looks different. Lots of features on a face with or without a veil. Okay. Then the attracting is after that alerting and activating is flying towards something, towards movement, towards smell, towards something that is different than they are used to. Somehow what they want to do initially is intimidate. They want to, for example, fly to the veil, but bounce off of it, or fly and bounce off an animal, fly off around the face of a person just walking in the apiary, for example. And then the person goes ahead and starts windmilling, trying to brush the bee away, arms flailing. And then they're going to move on to the fourth stage, which is either sting, and stinging is to attract more help because they do perceive it as a reason for defense from sisters, or they flee. Okay, it can be either of those two on the fourth stage in terms of defense. Now, these occur very rapidly, and it's hard to identify one, then two, then three, then four. I mean, all of a sudden you've got bees in your face. You do something to make it an intimidation, and they want to then intimidate back. All right. Defensive bees do not do anything other bees don't do. Okay, so defense is I mean, there's a lot there. There's mom, there's sisters, some more related than others. There are drones, there's some food resources, a lot of food resources. There's a whole structure that's been built patiently. There's a lot there in a hive. And so defense, there's good biological reasons for defense. But when we're going to call a colony defensive, oh my God, look at those, they compound after me. Then there are generally, we're looking at a hive or talking about a hive that is more quick and more persistent in terms of its defense of what it owns. Okay, so those are a little bit of definitions in terms of defensive. 10 reasons. Well, the beekeeper. We open the colony. We scrape the top cover across. We bounce things around. We hit the side. We walk on the soil. We do all those things. We walk in front of the colony. So we are often the major reason that bees are defensive. Whether the bees are very defensive or not, we are the reason that that defense amps up. Bigger colonies are more defensive. They've got a bigger soldier force. Now, all the bees are not as busy with all of the other activities, and so there's just more bees and more bees that can act in colony defense. Weather conditions, particularly changing. You've heard, perhaps you've remarked or seen or heard of others saying, well, ahead of a storm is not a good time to look at bees, and under very windy conditions, not a good time to look at bees. Is simply because the conditions are not as good for the bees, and they're likely to be more defensive. And more bees at home under some of those conditions. Hungry bees are, or a time when there are poor resources. Again, bees are not as, quote, busy as a bee doing other things, collecting resources, ripening the resources, building the comb to store those resources. And we just have a larger soldier cast. And so bees that are hungry. Bees sting because others have stung first. So in many cases, the soldiers are simply reacting. After that first wave, after that first attempt at activation and bees at making their decisions whether to sting or flee, if they make the decision sting, then the rest of the bees that may then come past them or beyond them or continuing are those that are more likely to sting. Why? Because they perceive the command, the odor, the pheromone that's in the alarm glands. The gland stays with the sting in your skin, in your bee veil, in the hide of the skunk or bear that's disturbing the colony, and bees are simply responding to it. It's simply a biological response. We know queenless colonies, much more likely to be defensive. Not sure exactly what's going on, but the pheromones get just all messed up, and things just kind of go downhill fast without a queen that's present in the colony. Smells, movement in front of the colonies, anything that vibrates the colony. Hive stands with multiple colonies working on it. All of those factors, things that are in the environment or that we're causing. Disturbances, predators, for example, we talked about the skunk that visits at night, disturbing the colony, mice that are moving in and out, disturbance to the colony. And we are their enemy. Even no matter how gentle you may be, it is going to create some disturbance. And of course, then we open up that dark, smelly hive to sunlight and air and lowering of temperature and humidity conditions that they're used to. So quick change in conditions, all those, could lead then to a colony defense. Change of location of the hive, change in smells, new cut lawn, new cut hayfield next to where your bees are, temperature changes. I mentioned about ahead of a storm. I do know how to spell that with the E in the right place. And finally, genetics. Bees of different genetic makeup are more defensive than others of a different genetic makeup. And of course, the classic case here are what we call our Africanized honeybees, or our AHBs. So some reasons why bees are defensive. I think you can probably think of some others of what you might want to add to that. I've talked about these and some of those other issues in Handling Defensive Bees. It was in Bee Culture magazine all the way back in April of this past year, so a little bit more than a year ago. If you want to see that article, you don't get Bee Culture and would like to get it, email me. I'll send you a copy including with the photos. All right, well, let's go one further amplification of defensive, and that is, because we disturb them, because we open their hive, we might get a sting, we might get two stings. But really, to start calling a colony defensive, one colony more defensive than, let's say, another colony, or the colony that's defensive in our apiary of 10 colonies or whatever, is bees in your face before you're doing anything. So you're coming into the apiary, you got to light your smoker, your veil's probably not on, your gloves probably not on to do all of that. And right away, you got some bees that are around right in your face, and you may get a sting right away. So that might be one reason why we would say, oh, well, that's a defensive colony. Bees stinging away from their hive. Defenses of a place. If you're barefoot and you step on a bee on a dandelion or a clover, you knock her off of her flower, she might sting your foot, but not frequently. But if you go up and you walk right in front of the colony, or you knock on the colony inadvertently or whatever, you get stinging. And so approaching bees, or even approaching their apiary, bees that are already there, that are waiting, if you would say, they're not waiting. But if bees have a wider defensive perimeter, they will be there around the apiary and might sting even as you get there. An excessive response that develops rapidly. And of course, this is usually upon getting some stings, but also just upon opening a colony. Not just, a couple bees investigating, bouncing into your veil, trying to intimidate you, but a number of bees that are doing that, a number of bees that just rush right out of the colony when you remove that cover and inner cover. And then continuation. So then as you move the cover and inner cover off to the side and start to remove a frame, you just, they just get a lot of bees just right in front of you, doing that, bouncing off the veil, bouncing off your gloves, or if you're not using gloves, on your hand, and may just for no reason at all seemingly sting you. They have a reason. They're a little more defensive. Moving your hand across and to, from one side to the other as you're trying to free that first frame. Freeing that first frame is jolting bees. You're very effective at alerting as you try to get that first frame out. But continued response, not just just a flush of bees and then they settle right back down, but continued. And then finally, I think another aspect that we might call defensive is again and again. It continues again and again, and it's not a one-time event. And I'm talking about the same colony that you think is defensive. So every time you go near it, every time you go near the apiary, you're going to get a sting. Some member of the family while they're out in the garden or on the lawn or at the pool or whatever are getting stings. And it's not just today, it just happened today, but it happens today and tomorrow and the next day, or a couple, 3 times a week or whatever. So the continuation of this same response by the bees. So those are some of the things I say that we might recognize bees as being a little bit more defensive. All righty, I'm going to go on Africanized honeybees because there is an issue where you keep bees relative to Africanized honeybees. I want to cover that, but I thought at this point, if there are some questions, I see some. Wolfgang says it is said that certain colors enhance the defensiveness, such as red and brown. Yeah, bees do respond to different colors. We certainly know that. Darker colors seem to be more responsive. So the red, which they see as dark, and the brown, which would be a darker color for them, a darker shaded color. Yeah. So yeah, I would say true. Yeah. Is it possible that bees robbed a dying mite infested hive, or it could be 1,000 other reasons the mite count is not as low as it should be? Okay, that's relate to the earlier answer again from the live people. Those are good responses to what was continued. Why was the mite number down? I would say, Dick, in your question, you found about a 2% level of mites. That is right on where we'd like to have them be. So at that level, I would not be terribly concerned. I would not give up. I would continue to do your monitoring, but I would say your Formic Pro did the job that we wanted it to do. And now in early September, your numbers are low. But as I said, don't give up. They can still bounce up, even though you might be the only one in your area. There may well be some other beekeepers you're just not aware of, or bees and bee trees, or some other locations, bees in houses.
I have a question.
Question, go ahead.
Yes. You were talking about robber bees earlier. How do you know robber bees from that are instead of the bees that are in the hive? How can you distinguish who are robber bees?
Looking for just a couple of minutes, you should be able to confirm they are doing an exaggerated in towards the entrance and then backing off, in towards the entrance and backing off. And it is different from orientation flights. The orientating bees do that initially, but then move away, and they're out here, 10, 15 feet away doing that circular and that bouncing. But robbers are right there, darting towards the entrance, but then back. And they're not bees landing. They're not the bees coming back with water, or bees coming back with nectar in their honey stomachs. They're not the ones landing and going on in to the colony. And then the second real clue, and I think it was really visible in that one illustration, is maybe I'll go back to it and we can look at it. And the bees trying to go in at other entrances. This one here, this is a breeding program. Notice how we've got all these bees here as we've only taken off a feeder top. All right. So all of a sudden there are a lot of these bees that are in the air, but notice the bees that are already on the ice outside here. They're here. This is not an entrance. They're not normally an entrance, but look how they're all accumulating here underneath the bar that lifts up the hive here. Those are typically where robbers will be, quote, looking for an entry into their colony. And then the gang of bees at the entrance, this bouncing, this back and forth. They seem to come in ready to go for landing, but then they bounce back up, and they're here in front of that entrance. Whereas the orienting bees will move on and off of further ways to try to do their orientation.
Wouldn't the bees in the colony notice this and defend against it?
Amen. Amen. And that's what some of the guards are looking for. The issue is that there are, particularly with our reduced entrance, we may have a few dozen guards, and we're talking about dozens of potential robber bees.
And so all the bees that are on the outside of the hive and they're trying to get in between the boxes, I noticed that a lot on my 2 hives. And that's all they seem to do.
Yeah.
Those would
Yep.
be robbers.
That would be an indication that robbing is going on. What you can do is take your gloved hand or a brush them away. Do they almost instantly come back at that same
Oh,
site as if
okay.
they're trying to get in?
That'll be useful. Thank you.
Okay. Wolfgang, I had calm colonies which became defensive when I opened the hives. Yes. What was odd was that the very defensive several days after as well. What may be the reason? And the reason is that is a characteristic of what we would call defensive. They remain agitated for whatever reason, and so they are establishing their perimeter around the colony, and that will persist. So persistence was one of those 5 features I mentioned in terms of making a determination. Yes, I have defensive bees. Help at all?
So one quick question, and it might be a little early as how to deal with it. But one of the points that you made was that larger colonies tend to be a little more defensive, just as a rule, I guess, which makes perfect sense. There's more in there. And clearly, as a beekeeper, you get excited as your hive is growing and getting huge, and you're thinking, oh, I got 5 stacks now. But for a backyard beekeeper, would the advice be, look, you should probably split that because you don't want this giant defensive hive in your backyard?
Yes or no. How's that for a definitive answer, right?
Thank you. Yeah.
And if we get another beekeeper, we'll get 3 more answers to the same question. Yeah, splitting and making nukes is one way to help handle some of this defensiveness. The second is that if we want to manipulate and handle our colonies, the nukes are funner. That's not a word, but are a lot more interesting to try to manipulate this time of year than those big old monstrous colonies. So you can still get your bee time in and get a feel of what's going on by manipulating nukes rather than trying to manipulate the full-time colony. So just staying away from those full-time colonies for as a response. I've got another list. I got 10 things that we might do for defensive colonies, but it starts with how do you handle a defensive colony? And the first answer I have is you don't. Unless you are prepared for stings and it's not going to be an issue with the neighbors, with your own family members. Got to get out there and pick the zucchini. Got to get out and get those tomatoes off the garden. Want to still play in the pool. I mean, so in part, those big colonies at this time of year, other than taking mite samples, that's kind of critical. Not manipulating them. And one of my other points is you do the manipulation later in the day, and then they have over evening to try to get that behavior out of their system, calm down. That's how I handle Africanized bees. I try to do it later in the day, and hopefully by morning they're not stinging the neighbors and getting my bees in trouble, getting my apiary site in trouble. Good question. Good comment. Others? All right, we'll have some time for questions. Hope we'll have some time for questions. So yeah, go ahead.
What do I do as a beekeeper about robber bees? If there seem to be a lot, what should I do?
It's a little bit like what we might do about swarming. Okay, it depends how far it is along. If it's a full-blown case of robbers have just ganged up on 1 or 2 colonies, throw wet towels, wet sheets, put a sprinkler on the colony, hose them down, stop it, try to stop it right in its tracks. And so that's one of the things we might do with swarming when we see a lot of queen cells. Now, the second part of that is we know this time of year, robbing is something that may likely occur. So we are going to try to prevent it from starting. So reduced entrance, robbing screens, avoiding moving honey around, avoiding dropping honey or sugar syrup, not using scented sugar syrups for any feeding that we do now this time of year. all of those things to try to keep that stimulus away somehow, trying to keep the bees that are available from discovering, hey, this is a great site. Let's take their honey. It's a hell of a lot easier than going to flowers and converting all that nectar. Little bee psychology there. So really stopping it before it gets started. If you see it started, try to halt it in its tracks. I mean, the sheet's right over the colony. So, I mean, those bees inside the colony have a difficulty trying to get out at all. And try to keep the sheets wetted if you can. Okay. All righty. Now, as I promised, I'd say something about Africanized honeybee. So on my map that I said, our steed is proceeding down the road. Let's see here. I got to figure out from my map where I am. Okay, yes, I'm going to be now talking about the basics of Africanized honeybees. Well, we know in a world there are bees that are different, and it's a result of their being in a place for a period of time and acclimating or getting used to that place. So in the world, at one point, we recognized subspecies. So we know our honeybee as Apis mellifera, but we know the German bee, the Northern European bee, is Apis mellifera mellifera. All right, mellifera. So this would be a subspecies name here in the Isles in Denmark and the Scandinavian countries across northern Germany, northern France, the Benelux countries. So we know there are these differences. We think of our bees as Italian honeybees because in 1860, Langstroth and some others imported a great number of Italian honeybees, then bred their own, and they just proved a heck of a lot better for our most of our North American beekeeping than did the mellifera bees, the first bees that were bought by the earlier colonialists. Well, we believe our honeybee, Apis mellifera, likely evolved in Asia. And then some bees moved from Asia through Middle Asia, through India, through the Middle East, and into the continent of Africa. Now, the bees that we call our European bees then moved out of Africa as the ice ages receded. And then because of isolation of the Spain Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, isolation of the peninsula of Italy, and the northern areas, developed into three kind of distinctive types of bees. The German or dark bees, Mellifera mellifera, the Italian bees, Ligustica, and the Iberian bees, Iberica. Now, those weren't is not the only route of bees early. A second route was through through the Middle East. And because of isolation here, more temperature and land masses and mountain still, a bee developed in Iran, different from a bee in Iraq, the Syrian bee, a different bee in the lower part, the Yemeni bee, for example. But that bee also moved as northward as the glaciers receded and became the bees that we know really as the Carnica bees and the Caucasian bees, Caucasica. The question mark is Carnica, but certainly Caucasica bees that moved north from that route. So bees differ, and because of their reactions or interactions with environmental conditions have different types of biology. So for example, the bees that moved into Europe, mellifera and the Italian bee, developed the ability to overwinter. So they developed the ability to store fat body in the fall, raise the fat fall bees, and store enough resources to survive the winter. Those colonies that didn't survive, so there were no offspring, but those colonies that did survive, and then next year would swarm and populate more hollows. But that was different from the conditions that were and still are in Africa. And so the bees that are still today, but at the time are in Africa, are different from, have different biological properties. They all have the same biological properties. It's just that through the interaction with an environment, they have developed differently. Now we're talking in terms of highly defensive bees, a bee that is called scutellata. It extends from South Africa, the country of South Africa, through East Asia, all the way up into Ethiopia. Along the coast, there's a fairly gentler bee. On the higher mountains, Mount Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro, there's another bee different from scutellata, and also a gentler bee. And the island of Madagascar has a different bee, and the tropical area, what we think of as the Congo of Africa, had a different bee, the Adansonii. And initially, when Africanized bees were named, they were mistakenly given this name, Adansonii. So some of the very old literature, you'll see Africanized bees, Apis mellifera Adansonii. That was incorrect. It is Apis mellifera scutellata. But the subspecies names are not really used to a degree because these are really ecotypes. Ecotypes. In other words, they're types of evolved bees, still honeybees, but evolved bees that have adapted to the local environmental conditions. They can all interact. So we can take a scutellata and it can interbreed and interact with mellifera. If we take scutellata and move it right up into Germany, where the mellifera bee was better adapted, it wouldn't survive, or not likely to survive. The mellifera bees would survive. Conversely, if we move the mellifera bees from Germany or the British Isles down to Kenya, Tanganyika, alongside scutellata bees, they wouldn't survive. The scutellata bees are a better ecotype and would survive better in that particular habitat. Well, part of the interaction with environment then includes the other huge player in the environment, and that is humans, you and I. All right. So a very traditional, long history of keeping bees in Africa consisted of very rustic hives. So shown is a wood type from one of my Peace Corps students that went to Kenya. Is shown as a Maasai warrior, one of the nomad groups of that country, with a fire and a lighted torch, and above his head, mostly males, the hive. And the hive is a piece of rolled bark, and the end is closed with a mixture of mud and animal dung. And this warrior now is about to harvest the hive. He's not have much in way of clothing. He's going to go ahead and he's going to actually drive the bees to one side of this hive, or right out of this rustic hive. And he's going to then steal. He's going to steal the combs. He's going to take combs that have brood, combs that have bee bread, and combs that hopefully at this stage have honey. And those are all going to be 3 products. And he's then going to melt the combs down on a fire the next day. And his income will be the beeswax. That's there'll be someone that comes by, they'll make it into blocks like we do, and someone will buy that beeswax. The honey that's not yet ripened is fermented almost right away because this is a brave act by warriors, and so then they have to have a celebration around it. And the honey that's in open cells is then fermented quickly and made into a light beer, but a fermented drink. The capped honey is taken to a market, a local market, and sold to others that don't have these hives. And the brood, the hives with a brood and a bee bread, is consumed in family or among the family or among the celebrants that are there to help this warrior harvest his colonies. So that's how bees and beekeeping have been occurring through centuries and centuries of time with this major bee, scutellata. It's not been in Langstroth movable comb hives. Now, we have introduced movable comb hives since, but this is the way that they used to keep them. So humans are a predator, just as the ants. That's why this is up in a tree, just as a badger, a type of badger, which we've kind of eliminated in our environment. But there were badgers up in the mountains. You can still see some badgers in California. And so it is there as a protection against predators, but obviously not against the human predator of stealing everything. They actually don't kill the bees. They just drive the bees away when they're harvest. So through that interaction, bees had become very defensive. Other groups, the Adansonii, the major harvest there was to stick something into the hive and withdraw it. And that's how our orangutans and our primates, some of the monkeys and the gibbons used to harvest honey. And humans that lived in the same environment learned the same thing. Cultures, some of the cultures that are in the deep and darkest places still do that method of harvesting. So they're not stealing and robbing a whole colony. They're just taking some honey from it for certain times a year. So that bee, Adansonii, is not nearly as defensive because it's being treated differently by humans and other potential predators than is the bee that we know now as Scutellata, or has developed this particular behavior. Another curious thing with the Scutellata is it has not developed the ability to store large resources. When the resources die up where it is, it leaves. We call that behavior absconding. That was not effective for the bees that moved up through the Iberian Peninsula or moved up through the Middle East. That didn't work, because if you abscond in October, there's no place you go that you now find some more resources. Whereas in East Africa, you can go 300, 400 miles and find another resource if you abscond your hive, but not so for those bees in Northern Europe. So this bee is not an overwintering bee. It's just not, it has the biology. It's just because of the interaction of humans and its environment, it tends to leave. In fact, when you do this harvest, often the bees do leave. And then so that they roll up these bark hives, store them for a while, and then put them back out a little bit later in the season. And the bees magically come back. They come back because now there are resources that they come back to. So that's a little bit of the background of why Africanized bees developed as such as they did. They were then moved from Africa, East Africa, to Brazil, where there was a big mixture of a good number of beekeepers that had movable frame hives, and the way that we kept bees 100 years ago in a couple, 100, 200, 150, 200 years ago in box hives. So this is a rustic hive. It's a box with just a piece of wood over the top. And often there somewhat of some slats that divide the two. And so at the right time of the year, just as you would harvest your Langstroth box, you come in, harvest your rustic box. You turn it upside down and you steal the honey. And so doing, you kind of drive the bees out of the part with honey that's in it by turning it upside down. With smoke, they go up, they want to go up. So you turn it upside down and they go off the frames of honey and onto the more frames that would brood. Which in reversal would be down on top. And so now you harvest honey until you hit brood and then you stop. So they were brought from this sort of care to sort of the hybrid care, and certainly then care in movable frame hives in Brazil. And it has changed both the bees and beekeepers. So here we have a couple of beekeepers looking at a box of bees. This is a Langstroth box. Using a very large smoker because of this defensive behavior. Now, why? The big question is why? Why did all this occur? And for that, we turn to a geneticist, Dr. Warwick Kerr. He was then charged by the beekeepers, given funds from the beekeepers to find a better stock of bees for Brazil. Brazil, fifth largest land country, was mired below 50% in the countries that had honey introduction in the world. And the Brazilian beekeepers thought, geez, we got all this territory, we got all these crops, we should be doing better. Maybe it's the bee. We've got the introduction of a European bee, so let's find a bee better suited. And so Care went to the Asian tropics and the African tropics and looked for another bee. He made a large number of selections and attempted to send his selections home, and they got insecticided, killed by pesticide by the people in Portugal on their way home. So he carried some queens illegally in his pocket, two from two sources, two queen breeders in the area of Pretoria, South Africa, and from some queens he still had from the country to the north of South Africa, Tanganyika, which is now Tanganyika is now Tanzania. Okay. Sounds strange? Well, remember what we did in the 1860s here in the US. We brought Italian bees to replace the bees that we had been introduced, a lot earlier in the early colonials. Okay, as they came on ships that came over the winter. So we did the same thing. In fact, we paid the USDA fellow by the name of Benton. We paid him to go to Europe to look for bees that might be more suitable for our beekeepers here in North America. He found and liked the Carniolan bees, introduced them, the Caucasian bees. He introduced bees from Egypt. He introduced bees from Syria. He introduced bees from a couple of the islands in the Mediterranean, South Italy, as well as northern parts of Italy. So he was actually paid to bring bees in here. Well, what stuck, of course, for us was the Italian bee. What stuck from this introduction of bees that Care brought back from in his pocket, the queens, was the scutellata, that bee that was so common in Eastern Africa and known to be defensive. Although the queen breeders in South Africa were using it, they didn't have a choice, but they were trying to develop bees that beekeepers could use, like our beekeepers do here. And then from that, there was a famous accident where they were released accidentally. Excluders were taken off colonies by mistake. And then rather than doing the breeding program, which was forecast, since they had escaped, nothing seemed to happen immediately, and gee, they spread very quickly, and gee, they kept swarming. This is great. They then started breeding and releasing virgin queens to anyone that wanted virgin queens. By 57, they were noted to be in the area of, they were introduced in 57 outside of Sao Paulo. Very quickly, they were noted to spread from Rio, then Sao Paulo to Rio, and then in the surrounding provinces. They were in Paraguay, a neighboring country, within 10 years, likewise into Bolivia, within 10 years of their introduction. They spread south into Uruguay, into Argentina, also as rapidly. And then they really started looking at how fast they spread. They spread very rapidly across the Amazon, which was not the prediction. They spread into Venezuela by 1977, so within roughly 20 years. The USDA had a huge program in Venezuela to have more beekeepers, and Venezuela, unfortunately, had the distinction of having the greatest number of deaths from bee stings by bees in the first years of introduction. They had over 100 people die from bee stings, excessive numbers of bee stings, as well as people allergic, in each of the first 3 years of the bees' arrival into Venezuela. They crossed the isthmus, and I picked up the first swarm in 1982 on the outskirts, the second swarm, outskirts of Panama City. They moved into Mexico and by 86, and into the United States by 1990. Now, how did we know this movement? We knew this movement initially from bees all of a sudden becoming defensive. European bees in the tropics are not very defensive. They're not very productive, but they're not very defensive either. normally, but this is a difference. And usually it was stinging of animals, animal pets, dogs, chickens, for example, animals that were penned up, horses that were tied up that couldn't escape, and deaths of people as well. Now, the initial bee that escaped then thought, well, it's going to hybridize with the bees there, the European bees that were there. So one of the names then developed initially was Africanized bee, signifying that it was a bee from Africa that was hybridizing, crossing with the European bees in the area where it occurred in Sao Paulo, Brazil. That was false. It was not doing that. It was maintaining its own identity, and then changing and eliminating the European bees, eliminating simply through competition. Not that they were killing them, but simply through competition and some other facets of its biology. We've tried to name it some other things. Brazilian bee, because of it being in Brazil, that did not stick. That was not very accurate. The assassin bee, the neotropical bee, the beekeepers in Brazil knew it initially as la abeja extranjera, the foreign bee. And then Time magazine had the distinction of naming it the killer bee. They were seeing some articles in the papers in Brazil, magazines, about these bees. And there was a famous accident of a bus that ran off a road, and a couple students and a driver were killed, and they ran off the road because of bees. And so it was recorded that the bees killed the students in this bus, and the driver. And so they did not want to use foreign bee. They debated assassin bee, and they ended up in Time magazine calling it killer bee, as a translation of foreign or assassin bee from Brazil. And I mentioned that it reached the US by 1990. The country of Texas, yeah, I guess it can be, the state of Texas began a very extensive trapping program. We were looking at how to ID them from some studies that Marla Spivak and some others were doing. Some of Orly Taylor's students were doing in South America. We found that we could identify the bee because it is smaller bee, physically smaller. So we could do some measurements of its wings and some body measurements, and we could identify with pretty good precision bees that were African bees versus bees that were European bees. And so Texas did a monitoring program. They put out swarm traps, basically bait hives, and they monitored its spread across Texas. So you see very southern Texas, a deep red, then a lighter red, and then an orangish red. And those are all records that came about from actual trapping of colonies, feral trap colonies, and then looking and seeing what their makeup was, whether they were European bees that were to the bait box or whether they were Africanized bees to the bait box. And so within a few years, you can see some different colors here. All but one county happened to have records of Africanized bees. The one county just so happened to have two of the biggest queen breeders in the state, but never ever has had a positive finding of Africanized bees, and it's right here in the middle, of course. They moved from the Atlantic Caribbean side of Mexico into Texas. They also advanced the Pacific side a little bit slower, so they did not move into either Arizona or California until 1994. And it was not a spread of Texas westward. It was bees coming through a different part of Mexico to reach California and Arizona. USDA initially had some maps. So this is of a map that USDA did. This is a map that they did in 2006. Shortly after bees were introduced into Florida. Again, they did not spread from Texas to Florida, but came through an introduction of bees through the port of Tampa into the state of Florida. And then after this point, they decided, no sense doing any more mapping. Everyone's got the Africanized bees, and so they gave up on mapping. So the mappings no longer continue. But we have some more better information relative to California. So let's get to the nitty gritty here. So I indicated they arrived in 94, the western route through Mexico. They were looked at in an article in 2006, again, a 2015 study, and another one, a more recent one. And so number initially looked basically at the California border, San Diego County, right on the border with Mexico, and looked in terms of whether hybridization was occurring. But they found that as they looked at the bees that were defensive and had these characteristics, they had primarily genes of the Scutellata African bee genes. It was not a hybridization that was occurring. A 2015 study looked at a total of 265 bees at 91 sites. Okay, that's important. 265 bees, only 265 bees. And they collected them from flowers. And they found that what they could identify as Africanized honeybees were then near Sacramento, but only 155 miles further north from a 2006 study. I'm going to have a map in a minute. They concentrated their sampling in San Diego County, and they found that about 60% of the bees that they collected were Africanized bees, had this African genetic material. By this time, we were not looking just at measuring their physical difference. We were now looking at genetic markers, so that we were actually doing an analysis of the genes, some of the genes, really only 3 markers that we found were in African bees, but were not in European bees. So when they did that, 60% of the bees they found were Africanized. But when they collected some bees from some of the managed bee colonies, mostly commercials over towards the valley, Imperial Valley, but a couple of hobbyists on the coastal range as well, only 13% of them were exhibiting this Africanized quality. As I indicated, some of this can be done. Africanized bees do it smaller. So you're recording this, so you'll have this journals that you're able to look at. So let's look at the maps. Let's go to the maps. So here was the study in 2006. This indentation up here is San Diego County. So here's San Diego all the way down on the bay. The red dots signify bees that were genetically markered Africanized bees. The open circle ones, indeterminate. They had some of the markers, but the green ones were what they felt were not Africanized. Those were European bees. Okay, so that's just San Diego County. And then they did their analysis coming northward. So through Orange County, through Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, on up into the Bay Area. And you're seeing that most everything up here is green. This is 2006, are green dots. And so the bees they were collecting there were, they felt, not showing the genetic markers for Africanized bees. The highest was like at San Luis Obispo in that county, Santa Barbara, along the shore, and of course, where they did most of their sampling here in San Diego County. So this is the 2006 study. That was the one that was listed. In 2018, Lynn and at UC Davis Johnson did a further study. So 2018, another +1, Africanized bees extend their distribution in California. And so they then they collected a much larger sample, and they also then represented for the counties a percentage of bees that they found that were Africanized. So you can see the lower counties, San Diego, Riverside, Orange County, et cetera, no number, because most of the bees they were getting were Africanized. And then as you come up along the coastal counties and into the Bay counties, a lower percentage of the bees that they picked up that then had the markers for Africanized honeybees. And they were indeterminate for Yolo, Nevada County, the counties there around San Diego. I'm sorry, Sacramento. Okay, so you can go to that and get the a little more detail in terms of what that study was able to show. Now, let me introduce one other aspect. When the bees expanded from Brazil southward, they inhabited about half of Uruguay and parts of northern Argentina, but not the Pampas region west of Buenos Aires, and not Patagonia parts of Argentina, or seemingly did not. And they weren't not finding defensive bees there. And so what was thought was that there was a hybrid zone that developed, north of which in Brazil, northern Argentina, northern part of Uruguay, most of the bees that you would pick up would be Africanized, and colonies could be very defensive. But south of an area, most of the bees that you would pick up and analyze, or the colonies, would be non-defensive and more not showing those genetic markers for Africanized bees. So Calfrey did the same for California. So here's a look at this hybrid zone. So the lower bar here is looking at Argentina. So it's starting down at the lower latitude, down towards Tierra del Fuego. The blue signifies that the bees that they pick up are essentially European bees. They don't show the markers for African. You pick up a few that have a mixed number, and then there's just a tad bit of red that will appear in some bees that you pick up down there. As you come north in Argentina, passing Buenos Aires, you find that the bees that they pick up are Africanized, have the genes for Africanized honeybees. Some that have some of the genes, but by now in northern Argentina and northern part of Uruguay, there's no bees that you pick up that have what they would declare as European bees. And so represented here, Buenos Aires is one of these bays here. So below Buenos Aires, below European bees, as you come northward, you get a bit of a transition zone. But then as you go further north towards the Paraguay border, you get nothing but Africanized honeybees. And the study that was done separately of Uruguay, the same way. Southern part of Uruguay, Montevideo, et cetera, the coastal areas, more European. As you go north of the cattle raising area, more Africanized bees. So the Calfrey and others from San Diego State then said, is that what is happening also in California? Are we getting a hybrid zone setting up? So here's the data they have, a lot fewer numbers, a lot fewer years, for example, from California. So as you are starting north from Redding, most of the bees you pick up are European. There's a little bit that will have some genetic markers. And then as you go south, you start passing Sacramento. Now you get a lot more red that is showing up for genetic markers that are Africanized, still some European markers. And then as you go further south to San Diego County, Orange, San Diego, Riverside, then most of the bees that you pick up are Africanized. And the only European bees you pick up there are generally around commercial beekeepers. And the difference is commercial beekeepers are requeening with European stock. So does it look like there could be Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, or perhaps the Bay Area, a transition zone where most of the year, most of the time, the bees are going to be mostly European, as in the area of Buenos Aires and south, or is this transition line going to be different? None of the other states in the U.S. have looked quite at it at this to this extent as our California people have done with their studies. Open question. I don't have an answer for that. Neither do the researchers. This is one study. One study in science never is the complete answer. Has to be repeated. Find similar results. Other people finding some of the same types of results. I did with using the big powerful computers in Washington DC with some others. We looked at a suitability index. This is in my book, In this case, across the U.S., the states of the U.S., blue signifies that European stock. The orange and the yellows signify that where the Africanized bees would be, are now, and when we did our study, now 15 years ago, and then we're predicting where they might spread based on temperature, based on a whole number of environmental factors that we threw into the computer and let the computer chunk away. So what you can see from that is you get sort of smiles up east and west coasts, but I'll pull your attention particularly to California. And you can see the lighter color signifies that those are areas where there will or could be Africanized bee stock based on where they already were from our data from Southern California, Southern Arizona. I think we had some New Mexico along Las Cruces data and some Texas data that we had put into our database, and then a bit along the East Coast as well. Since then, another group at Colorado State, another powerful computer, has looked at it, and they've come up with a slightly different scenario where they even predict some of British Columbia and some of the maritime provinces in Canada are suitable habitat for them. All right, so all beekeeping is local. So where are we local? All right. In the area where you exist, or most of the members exist, and southward, the feral or the wild honeybees, not the swarms that come out of a managed colony necessarily, but the wild honeybees may or may not be Africanized, and they will, if so, we could tell in summer or fall, not during the winter period. Africanized honeybees, we know, swarm much more frequently than our honeybees. And so colonies that just you can't keep from swarming may indeed have some of the genetic material. The biology of Africanized honeybees is to reproduce as fast as you can. It's simply a survival instinct. And that also means one of the reasons why they have fewer issues with mites. Africanized honeybees are gleaners. They don't wait in their hive to be stimulated by scout bees, okay, or by the conditions or temperature even. So they're out, and many of them are home. They bring home the forage, and in an area of a couple of miles from where you have hives, if there's some feral colonies in the area, they've harvested a lot of the resources before your bees even wake up and get out from the colony, because they're waiting to get that stimulation. Africanized bees are not honey stores, all right? Their biology, their predominant biology is if conditions are poor, you leave. They abscond. They simply leave the area to look for better forage. Now, that's not adaptive in your area in San Mateo and in the area around the bay. That's not adaptive because you got to go an awful long way. You got to go all the way to San Diego before you're going to find anything in the month of September that's halfway decent forage. And then there's a lot of bees down there that are already using it anyway. Okay, so it's not very adaptive, but in Africa it has been adaptive, and in some parts of Brazil it has as well. So this remains a characteristic. They maintain their own identity, and not one way, not two ways, but several ways. When they abscond, they may usurp another colony, in other words, invade another colony, kill the colony queen, and just go in and make slaves out of the European workers until they die. They control their drones, and they don't allow drones drifting into their colonies. The same way the Apis cerana, the original host of our Varroa mites, the same way they help control mites. They don't have a problem with Varroa mites, and they do it partly through control with drones. They don't grow fat body, and so the mites that are on the adults don't tank up on that good rich protein, and they're just not as good reproducers. They just don't produce themselves as well. So there are a number of ways that they maintain their own identity, and one of them is they don't get stressed with mites, okay? Where they do occur, commercial beekeepers, as long as they have a source, can requeen, and they must requeen regularly, some twice a year. Many of our US beekeepers at least once a year. But if you know some commercial beekeepers that move into your area, So what if bees are defensive? That's not a negative. You know, I mean, they're dealing with bee stings all the time and are handling it. So defensiveness is not and for many of them is not a heritable characteristic. For some of the breeders it is, but the commercials don't care about defensive or not. And then what we need and where we live is we need to avoid feral bees. You know, at one time we always recommend if you capture a swarm, you make a split, move it, set it up in another hive. If you suspect something wrong, you're getting like characteristics of sac brood or European foul brood, set up what we call a hospital yard. Do that, and then you know, see what stock it is. What is that stock? Is it stock you want or not? If not, get rid of it, euthanize it, get rid of that colony. Don't move it on into your apiary. And so this very much applies to trying to capture swarms in an area where now we start getting when we look at bees, we start getting, you know, 15%, 20% that come up to be with the genetic markers, come up to be with the stock. And again, towards the end of the season, this simply applies. Those absconds don't hive anyway, but leave them alone, let them go, let them perish over the winter period that you have, the dry period. Don't try to hive those. You're just asking for trouble, asking for a defensive colony. One thing that hasn't happened is the killer bees. There was a huge amount of hype. How many remember the hype? You know, head for the hills. We're only going to keep bees in Alaska. You know, we're never going to be beekeepers. Our food is going to wreck and ruin because killer bees are coming. Killer bees are coming. Warning, killer bees are coming. Well, we've learned to manage. Venezuela eventually dropped below 100 deaths per year. Some of the other countries taking advantage of that information, including the U.S., including Mexico, have kept down those accidental stingings. That happens. We unfortunately lose animals and lose people from stingings all of a sudden from bees that are very defensive. The colonies get disturbed, but certainly did not live up to their hype. Thank goodness, did not live up to their hype. Okay, so yes, the warning: killer bees are coming. Well, whoop, no, the killer bees are here already. But they're just thankfully not killing a lot of humans or a lot of animals, but it may occur, unfortunately. Unlike the murder hornet, which hasn't killed anyone, but supposedly could. They murder bee colonies. We'd like to get that name out of there. So what has changed? Bees and the beekeeper, okay? We have hybridized them to a degree. Beekeepers in Brazil prefer Africanized bees. And they do because they don't have a choice. Beekeepers in Southern California and South Texas and South Florida prefer them because they don't have a choice. The only colonies that are productive are Africanized bees. The European bees are not at all productive in those areas simply because they don't compete for the resources the same way Africanized bees compete. And so they're just not productive and they just go downhill. So unless you have some some Africanized bee stock, you're not going to be a beekeeper in these areas where there are large numbers of feral colonies. Now, that's not true for the Bay Area yet because there are not large numbers of feral colonies. Will there ever be large numbers of feral colonies? The number will ebb and flow. There'll be more towards the end of the year, but will there ever be large numbers? We don't have a definitive answer to that. The best guesses are no, but that is only a guess. We don't have the definitive answers. All right. I keep bees for part of the year in Bolivia. And these are Africanized bees in Bolivia. So you see we're well dressed. We keep them apart. We keep dividing them. We don't often super them, although we've got a feeder on this one. And here, this was early, and we had 2 boxes, but generally we keep them in 1 box and we harvest the outer frames, or we might have a small super on if it's intense flow, okay? So here's where Bolivia is, stuck in the middle of South America. Its neighbors are Brazil and Peru, Argentina, Chile, etc. And so where I keep bees are in the mountain valley where the Amazon River starts. So all these rivers eventually flow north into the Amazon, become the Amazon River. And so the size of the valley is how many bee colonies there can be. And I'm in one of the largest ones at Cochabamba, a city, this third largest city, at an elevation of 8,200 feet. So it's almost double again, or it's a quarter, it's a half again as high as Denver. All right. Talking of Las Cruces, another 1,000 feet higher than Taos and Las Cruces in New Mexico. But a big valley, a valley of fruit and dairy cows before the people have taken over the agricultural land, and just one of the best of the valleys for beekeeping. So I started with a family had bees, and now we have a nephew that takes care of the colonies. There are bees in a town square, or just here's a patio. This is one of the churches on the square. Every Bolivian city has a big square with one or more churches. Keep them where near other animals. There's a big pig operation around the corner from here. In this apiary, you don't approach as close as this. You light your smoker all the way back of the house, because as soon as you get here, you got bees in your face, bees that are already trying to do that intimidation. And how do they know we're coming? That's what defensive bees do. They have a bigger defense perimeter, and they know. But we'll do this late in the day, and occasionally the owner pays for a dead pig that's been stung to death, that couldn't get away from the stinging animals, and he just pays for it for his neighboring farmer. We do keep them in the city, but you see all small colonies breeding. Here's my beekeeper, Franco, and a pretty darn good beekeeper. He knows what he's doing. So he's raising bees in the city, and then he's taking his production colonies out to the countryside. Here's another production closer to where I live in the northern suburbs. You can see we're in a huge valley, so everywhere you look, you go up. So this is above 11,000 feet here on this peak over here. These are all breeder queens, so this is all breeding in a city. And then we requeen with queen cells. That's how we try to maintain a gentler stock. And we're breeding here because we can control the drones better. So with our Africanized bees, what is problem 1, 2, and 3? Here's 1, queens, finding queens. Can't find a queen. Queens are very sensitive to light. As soon as you open a colony, they take off. It's impossible to find queens. So you have to run the colony through an excluder if you want to find the queens. But we don't do it that way. We simply take 2 brood frames and make up 3, 4 nukes, depending on how much brood frame there is. Usually 3 nukes. One gets the queen. All 3 get the capped queen cell. The one that has the queen kills the queen cell. The other 2 use the queen cell to requeen. So we're effectively reducing the size of a bigger colony, 5 or 6 frames of brood, down to 2, and making 2 more colonies with our selected stock. And eventually we're going to find the one that did have the queen by looking for eggs, and we'll get rid of her and then put a second queen cell in that one. It's about the only way you can try to control your stock, and it works at best sometimes. So problem number 2 is the feral swarms. People do stupid things with swarms, and even beekeepers do the same thing. And so trying to remove swarms, get rid of them, et cetera, et cetera. It's a recipe for disaster. They get very, very defensive, and you just can't get rid of all of them. And so they stay defensive, and people end up having to abandon the house if you try to take the swarm out of the building. So euthanize it. I mean, euthanizing was a way that beekeepers did at one time, and we got to save every last colony. Oh, crapola. We don't need to save every last colony. Get rid of those that have problems. And problem number 3 is they are such poor honey producers. Okay. Problem number 3 is they really are poor honey producers. Look at this population. We'd throw that colony away if it was European bees. Soon as resources come, this colony explodes. This box of barely a couple frames of brood, a little bit of brood on a couple frames, explodes, literally explodes. They rear some drones, and within a month, they're storing frames of honey on the outer side, which we're going to start harvesting. And we keep harvesting so they don't think that they're done. So we take a frame out, 2 frames out on either side, harvest them, and put them right back in. What we'll do is we'll harvest some one day, and then take the wet frames and put them back in on the sides when we take a frame out. We don't want to come back the next day to to disturb a colony that we disturbed the day before. That's a recipe for disaster right away. But we'd throw this colony away if it's a European colony. You know, think that that's crap. Well, not with Africanized bees. They're superb. To give them a little bit of protein, pollen, and they're off to the races, rearing drones very early in the cycle, raising queens and preparing to swarm within a month. Okay. Our bees have got to build up a couple, 3 months before they're ready to start thinking about swarming. And then some of them don't anyway. This bee, the swarms that we capture also swarm, and the swarms that we capture of swarms that we've captured also swarm. So it's not unusual for colonies to swarm 4, 5, 6 times if they're not managed at all. So from these feral sites. Non-problem number 1, and I've talked about it, is Madam Varroa. We do not need to treat for mites with our Africanized bees. I'll repeat again, we do not need to treat for mites. I'll get mite numbers up to as high as 12% in Africanized honeybees. But the bees themselves are controlling Varroa mites. They're not raising them on a lot of drones because the bees themselves are not raising a lot of drones. They're controlling when they raise their drones. They don't have fat body. And so these mites just kind of starve as they're trying to feed on adults. They don't get enough protein, and though they're very poor egg layers. And then the Africanized workers develop in about, on average, 19 days. Our European bees are about, on average, 21 days. Those 2 days, all the difference in the world that mama mite, when she goes in the cell, has to have some time to produce her eggs. The first egg is a male, and then at least another day before she produces a female egg. She can't raise a mature female daughter. There's not enough time within that capped worker brood. There is in the drones, but not within the workers. So they've got a number of factors, and so we just don't treat. We don't treat for them. Now, if, as in Brazil, you bring in a lot of European stock and you're continually mixing European stock in with the African stock, yeah, now we're going to have to start treating for mites because it's this European stock. The bees having more fat body, the mites tank up on the fat body and then are able to do a better job in their reproduction. So, last point I said, need we be concerned? And again, I don't have an answer. And there is not a simple answer. Are we concerned that they are spreading further north in California? Yes. Are we concerned that there's not enough studies to try to determine if there is a zone? Is there a study to determine that we should limit movement of bees from South California to Northern California, like they do in Argentina, and enforce it strictly? We don't have those answers. We don't have the science to try to demonstrate some of those answers yet. They are in the queen bearing area of California, the lower parts of it. You saw the pink for Yolo County. The areas back from the bay, where of course they had some terrible fires and have lost a couple of queen breeders, but there are different queen breeders that moved into that area. Yeah, they're in that area. We are finding them in an area. We're finding them fairly regularly in the almond area. You can find them today in Stockton, probably in and around Sacramento, not up into Nevada County, perhaps, but in around San Mateo, certainly county. We can find them. They're there. They're not in numbers. So will there be more? Will there be numbers? Part of the response, as you can well recognize, is the human factor. What do we do? Why don't we have some sort of a restriction? Why don't we have a better monitoring of what might be Africanized? You know, that monitoring is now in the hands of the queen breeders. Is that adequate? Are they doing an adequate job? Do they know what stock they have? And I'm not going to condemn them that no, they don't, but do they know enough of what it might be? Do they have the PCR to do the analysis and looking at your genetic factors? Short answer is no, they don't. What are they determining on? Defensive colonies. However, as I indicated, commercial beekeepers, defensive colonies is a different dog, a different rule than it is for you and I in our backyard colonies. And it's not something that they're really concerned with. They're not, I mean, they all have hygienic bees, but they're not really concerned. They're not really breeding for hygienic. They're using breeder colonies that are the best colonies that they feel. And some of them certainly on hygienicity, some of them on defense, but what do they want for bees? They want bees that build up fast. That's Africanized bees. They want bees that are good pollinators, that get out early to those flowers. That's Africanized bees. No, they're not breeding for them, but their customers want the things and some of the qualities that are Africanized bees. So should we be concerned? We should be concerned that we don't have better answers right now. We certainly should. Handling, don't. Avoid movement, vibration, use your best PPE, manipulate only when necessary during appropriate weather conditions, manipulate at the end of the day. Be gentle, but fast, avoid excessive time consuming manipulations. Manipulate the weaker, smaller colonies. That's how we should learn. Don't mess with those full-size colonies, not in August. It's no fun. Keep colonies small, split, requeen units with selected queen cells, harvest frequently, and then most important, and I wish we did more of it, euthanize. If defensiveness continues, not just one time all of a sudden I'm getting stung by this colony, but if it's those qualities that I indicated, the 5 qualities, euthanize. We've got to do more of that. So we're part of the, let's not be part of the problem, but let's be more reactive as part of the solution. All right, some comments, defensive bees and Africanized bees. I've used up a lot of your time. Everyone's gone home. They've even pulled up the chairs from the library there. There's one more chair and he's going to pull it up. No, I thought you were going to pull that chair up right away. Go ahead.
This is a really dumb question, but I don't mind asking dumb questions. When you say a hybridized African bee, is that a combination of an African bee and a European bee?
So it's not pure genetic material from Africa, and it does have a combination of some of the European genes. So yes, it is a combination.
It sounds like Africanized bees, they produce so little honey that it would be very hard to harvest. They're not really used for harvesting, they're used for pollinating. Is that closer to correct?
Well, they don't have the setup like we do, the great need for pollination that we do, although almonds are in and avocado in some of these countries. So they're not yet getting their money from pollination. So most of the beekeepers are still getting their money from honey. There goes the last chair. Gonna have to go home.
Thank you.
But you're not gonna be able to sit down.
We only have the room till 8:30,
Ah, okay. That makes sense. Sorry about it.
8:45 at the latest.
Yeah. Well, thank you for allowing us to be on site as well as virtual.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Extra credit for staying till the end.
Yes, yes. Everyone, Honey Stick is in your future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. So I think you kind of answered this question already, just based on your talk, but I was curious, since you were one of the first to see the Africanized colonies coming up, have you noticed that they've calmed down at all as compared to that first, really defensive